The topic for today is Zen Maturity, a natural multi-model approach. We're really going to be looking at what are the best practices that I've seen and we've seen in teams that I've worked with toward multi-model implementations, and really looking at how does that differ from the traditional approach, and looking at those differences. And as you know, there's no silver bullet. So we won't be talking about the best way. We'll be talking about, first of all, what's the traditional multi-model approach, and what's the problem? Why is it so difficult to look at multiple standards, multiple models, multiple regulations, and apply those in an organization? And then how do you move away from that, and what's the better way, or what we're terming here the Zen Maturity approach? I know it seems like kind of holistic and more of the high level, but that's really the way that you have to look at this. It really is not looking at it from a perspective of the traditional approach or compliance, but rather looking at it from a perspective of how do we apply in a natural way. So what is a traditional approach? The traditional approach that we've seen in applying multiple models and standards and regulations in most organizations really is embodied in this picture that most of you have seen. It's an old picture. It's been around a long time. The framework's Quagmire, originally created by the Software Productivity Consortium. But it really does encapsulate, the problems, and the problems still exist. Some of the models have changed. CMMI is now, or CMM is now CMMI. ISO 9000 has been updated. There's other models and standards and regulations that have changed, but it's still the same problem of multiple drivers, multiple directions, multiple expectations on the organizations, and compliance. And being driven in most cases by these multiple standards and regulations toward that compliance. Well, forcing that compliance never works. It's the traditional problem of trying to force the round peg in a square hole, as you see here, and getting a bigger hammer never works. It's just not natural. It's not the way to apply the models and standards. It's not the way to apply one, let alone multiple models and standards. It's moving away from forcing the compliance and moving into a more natural approach is really what works. But why doesn't that compliance work? Well, it doesn't work because of the inconsistencies between the various standards and models and regulations. They have different underlying purposes, different intents, different terminology. If we think about configuration management, for example, a simple activity that's done in most every successful organization, change management or configuration management. If you look in some of the models, they talk about it being configuration management. In other models, they talk about it being change management. In other places, it's data management. In other places, it's requirements change management. But are they different? No. The underlying expectations are the same. So if you're focusing on the models and standards, you're not really adding the value necessary. And if you start from the mapping the models and standards to each other, then you come up with an academic exercise, because just about anybody can map models to standards to regulations, and if you have three people mapping those, you have three different maps. So it really doesn't provide the value needed in an organization to apply these various models and standards. As I said, they have the different underlying intents as well, in that some of them are developed in order to decrease supplier risk. Other ones are developed for internal improvement. And those different intents, while they're focusing on trying to do the same things, those different intents do cause differences in the details. And as we see, in many cases, the devil is in the details. That's really where the problems occur when you start to apply these different models and standards in the same organization and focus on those models and standards first. Then what happens is you run into brick walls. So how do we move away from that? Well, there is a better approach. It's what we're terming as the Zen Maturity. And the path to Zen Maturity really is through these 6 ideals. And I won't even call them steps because they really grow upon each other. And we'll talk about each one in more detail as we go through the next few slides. But it's really looking at things from a more holistic way. And we'll talk about each one of these ideals and talk about what's expected in them. Then we'll get a little bit more practical and talk about how do we really apply them. So don't be concerned yet that what you're seeing here is pretty high level, and you'll see in the next few slides is pretty high level. But then we do get to the more practical perspective of how do we apply these and trying to maintain these ideals as you go throughout applying multiple models and standards. And just for effect, over on the right, there's the requisite to go with the Zen Maturity. So you'll see that in a few places in the slides. So let's look at the first one then. The first of those ideals is seek to understand before being understood. And that is really critical. It's very hard, but it's really critical. What are you seeking to understand? You shouldn't be seeking to understand the models and standards and regulations first, no matter how many models and standard regulations you have to apply in an organization. What you need to understand first is the business, the industry, the organization you're applying them in, and the customers and vendors that are involved in that organization, and especially the objectives of the organization. Really understanding deeply the organizational breakdown structure, the people in the organization, the functions that occur, the activities that occur, not focusing on the models and standards first, but on the business. And at this point, you don't want to focus on the models and standards. And it's not that you don't want to at all, but at this point, when you're starting to look at an organization, you really need to understand the details of what's done in that organization, who does what, and how it's done. And building on that understanding, then, you really want to understand what comes naturally. Define the functions that naturally occur. So when I say functions that naturally occur, I talked about configuration management earlier. And configuration management is a good example of that. It's called many things in many different places. It naturally occurs in most organizations. When it doesn't, many times they recognize a problem exists, and something happens to fix that. They may call that change management. They may call it data management. They may call it a lot of things in an organization. But look at what naturally occurs, and how do those things naturally occur. In many cases, we find that the functions that are performed in an organization are very different in an organization that's focused